At 10:17 in the morning on June the 19th, 1944, at 18,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, a Japanese naval aviator pressed the trigger on his twin-type 99 20mm cannons and watched the Grumman F6F Hellcat ahead of him absorb the burst without catching fire. He had executed the attack correctly. He had closed to approximately 100 yards. His deflection angle was sound. The shell struck the American fighter's wing root and mid-fuselage. By every principle that Imperial Japanese naval aviation had built its combat doctrine around across 3 years of Pacific War, the Hellcat should have burned. That was what happened when high-explosive cannon rounds found an unprotected aircraft at close range. That was the outcome Japanese pilots had come to treat as a near certainty. The Hellcat shuddered. A thin trail of smoke appeared at the wing root and disappeared within seconds. The American pilot rolled away in a hard diving turn that built airspeed faster than the Zero could safely follow. The Hellcat descended several hundred feet and leveled off below. Its engine was still running. Its pilot was still alive. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. What happened in the sky above the Philippine Sea on June the 19th, 1944 was not a tactical surprise produced in isolation. It was the visible conclusion of an engineering argument that had been building for 7 years, in 2 design rooms on opposite sides of the Pacific, by engineers who held fundamentally incompatible beliefs about the single most consequential question in fighter aircraft design: what the machine was actually built to protect. This is the story of that argument: the aircraft it produced, the men who flew them, and the largest single-day aerial engagement of the Second World War. The Imperial Japanese Navy's confidence going into the summer of 1944 had a specific foundation. It was not founded on arrogance alone, though arrogance was present. It was founded on a record that had been genuinely extraordinary. From December of 1941 through the spring of 1942, the Mitsubishi E6M0 had operated over the Pacific and Southeast Asia with a dominance over Allied fighter aircraft that produced kill ratios American intelligence officers initially refused to accept as accurate. Over Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, over Darwin and the Dutch East Indies, over the approaches to Singapore, Zeros had met Allied fighters in turning engagements and destroyed them with a consistency that bordered on systematic. The aircraft that fell most frequently in those encounters were the Brewster F-2A Buffalo and the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, each heavier and less maneuverable than the Zero, and they fell not simply because the Zero outflew them, but because when the Zero's cannons connected, the result was almost always fire. This pattern was not incidental to Japanese doctrine. It was the doctrine. The Type 99 Mark I 20mm cannon installed in the A6M2, based on the Swiss Oerlikon design and adapted for Japanese carrier aircraft, was a weapon of genuine destructive power. At its rated cyclic rate, the cannon fired 470 rounds per minute. A burst of 2 seconds delivered approximately 15 to 16 explosive projectiles into the target area. Against an American fighter aircraft with no armor plating behind the pilot's seat and no self-sealing rubber around its fuel tanks, those projectiles did not need to penetrate anything more substantial than thin aluminum sheet to reach the fuel system. Once they reached the fuel system, the result was predictable. High-octane aviation gasoline in an enclosed space, exposed to a hot fragmenting projectile, ignites. The aircraft burns. The Zero pilots of 1941 and 1942 had confirmed this sequence of events hundreds of times in combat. They flew with a confidence in their weapons that was rooted in observable reality. When the cannons fired and the burst was accurate, the enemy aircraft burned. This became an operational assumption so consistent that Japanese tactical doctrine built itself around it. The Zero would maneuver to a firing solution, the cannons would fire, and the engagement would end. The doctrine did not need to account for situations in which the enemy aircraft survived a solid burst, because in the first years of the war, enemy aircraft almost never survived a solid burst. The men confirming this doctrine in those early months were not representative of what Japan could replace. The pilots flying the Zero from December of 1941 through the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal in 1942 were the product of the Yokra Naval Aviation Training Program, one of the most selective and demanding military aviation programs that any nation had operated to that point in history. Of the thousands who applied, only a small fraction completed the years of physical conditioning, psychological selection, and flight instruction that produced a qualified naval aviator. The best of those graduates had accumulated 500 hours of flight time before their first combat mission, much of it in actual combat operations over China, where Japanese carrier aircraft had been testing and refining their tactics since 1937. These men knew their aircraft at the level of physical intuition that only extended hours can produce. They could feel the wing beginning to buffet before the stall. They could judge a deflection shot at 300 yards with the kind of precision that does not come from instruction, but from repetition. The victories they produced in the first year of the Pacific War were real. The problem that those victories concealed was also real, and it was this: the outcome of any air campaign is not determined by individual performance at the top of the skill distribution. It is determined by the ability of the system to replace losses faster than the enemy can produce them, and to improve the quality of replacement pilots faster than the enemy can develop countermeasures. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built an aviation training pipeline designed to produce a small number of extraordinary pilots. It had not built a pipeline designed to produce a large number of adequate ones. And the doctrine it had constructed around the certainty of cannon fire igniting enemy aircraft had not been tested against an enemy that had specifically engineered its aircraft not to ignite. That engineering began in earnest on the west side of Long Island, New York, in the fall of 1942, when Leroy Grumman's design team received a technical evaluation document from the United States Navy that described, in specific engineering detail, exactly what the Zero was and exactly what it was not. The document described what had happened in a waterlogged bog on a Kutan Island in Alaska that June. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga was 19 years old when he participated in the Japanese diversionary attack on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands during the Midway operation in June of 1942. His aircraft was an A6M2 Model 210, the standard production variant of the period. During a strafing run over American installations at Dutch Harbor, ground fire struck his aircraft and severed the return oil line of his Nakajima Sakai engine. Oil pressure began falling immediately. Koga radioed his situation and made for a Kutan Island, where the Japanese had designated an emergency landing site. The valley floor of a Kutan appeared from altitude to be a usable surface. It was a waterlogged tundra bog. When Koga lowered his gear and touched down, the wheels caught and the aircraft flipped forward, killing him instantly at the moment of impact. His Zero remained substantially intact. His wingmen, uncertain whether Koga was still alive inside the inverted cockpit, hesitated before the order to strafe the wreckage, and the moment passed. 5 weeks later, a United States Navy PBY Catalina on a routine patrol mission spotted the wreck, reported its position, and a recovery team extracted the aircraft from the mud. It was transported under guard to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego and turned over to a team of Navy engineers and test pilots. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders flew 24 evaluation flights in the restored Kutan Zero between September and October of 1942, testing it against examples of every current American naval fighter in the inventory. His after-action reports, compiled for the Bureau of Aeronautics and subsequently used in developing the revised tactical doctrine distributed to all Pacific Theater Fighter squadrons, documented two structural characteristics of a Zero that changed the terms of every air engagement the Pacific War would produce from that point forward. The first was the aileron response at high airspeed. The Zero's ailerons, optimized for authority at low speed to produce the turning radius that had been so effective in close-range maneuvering engagements, became physically difficult to deflect against aerodynamic loads above approximately 250 miles per hour. Above 270, a pilot of normal physical strength could not move them with sufficient authority to execute a precise rolling pursuit. In high-speed combat, The Zero could not effectively follow a target performing rolling maneuvers. The aircraft that appeared nearly impossible to escape in a turning fight at low speed became substantially less dangerous to an opponent who refused the turning fight and used the vertical dimension and sustained high speed instead. The second was the carburetor design. The Nakajima Sake engine used a float-type carburetor rather than a fuel injection system. When an aircraft entered negative G flight, the kind of steep nose-down push that would allow a pilot to accelerate rapidly into a dive, the carburetor was momentarily starved of fuel, and the engine stuttered for approximately 2 to 3 seconds. In the geometry of a pursuit, 2 to 3 seconds of reduced power output could end a chase or cost a pilot the firing window a particular attack geometry required. These two findings, combined with the structural analysis that revealed the absence of armor and self-sealing tanks, produced a precise tactical prescription that was distributed to American pilots across the Pacific. Do not attempt to match the Zero in a slow-turning engagement. Maintain energy. Attack from above. Dive, fire, and use kinetic energy to disengage before the Zero's maneuverability advantage can be applied. If the pass does not produce a kill, extend, climb, and repeat. Do not give a Zero a slow-speed chase. At any speed above 250 miles per hour, the Zero's greatest advantage disappears. These findings went directly to Leroy Grumman's engineering team, while the F6F Hellcats design was still being finalized. The F6F Hellcat that entered fleet service with Fighter Squadron 9 aboard USS Essex in August of 1943 was, in almost every physical dimension, the engineering inverse of the aircraft it had been designed to kill. Where the Zero had been stripped of every protective system to achieve performance within the constraints of a 940 horsepower engine, the Hellcat was built around 2,000 horsepower and used that surplus to carry everything the Zero had discarded. The Pratt & Whitney R2800-10 double wasp radial engine displaced 2,800 cubic inches across 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. At war emergency power, it produced 2,035 horsepower. This was more than double the rated output of the Nakajima Sake in its standard production form. The power surplus was not applied primarily to maximum speed, though the Hellcat's top speed of 376 miles per hour at 17,200 feet comfortably exceeded the Zero's. The power surplus was applied to climb rate, to altitude capability, and most critically to the ability to carry protection while remaining capable of performing the offensive mission. The pilot of an F6F sat inside 212 pounds of chrome-nickel steel plate. 3/8 of an inch of armor covered the back and sides of the pilot's seat from the base of the spine to the headrest. The curved windshield was flat, bulletproof glass, 1.5 inches thick, sufficient to defeat a direct hit from a rifle-caliber machine gun round at close range. The upper canopy framing incorporated bulletproof glass panels. Total armor weight in the standard production Hellcat exceeded 200 pounds before any optional additions. The fuel system addressed the fire problem directly. The Hellcat's internal tanks were constructed with a rubber compound lining that functioned through a chemical interaction with aviation gasoline. When a puncture allowed fuel to contact the lining, the gasoline acted as an activating solvent, causing the rubber to swell and seal the puncture from inside within seconds. The seal was not impervious to every form of battle damage, and a large fragmentation strike could produce a fuel leak that exceeded the lining's capacity to close. But the fundamental vulnerability of the unprotected metal fuel tank, the vulnerability that had made the Zero's wing and fuselage a fire source whenever a burst of incendiary ammunition reached it, was specifically eliminated in the Hellcat's design. The armament was calibrated to exploit the Zero's documented structural fragility. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing panel, each supplied with 400 rounds of mixed armor-piercing incendiary, and tracer ammunition, gave the Hellcat a combined rate of fire exceeding 3,000 rounds per minute when all guns were firing simultaneously. A sustained burst of 2 seconds delivered more than 100 rounds into the target area. Against an aircraft built from extra super volume and sheet of the minimum thickness consistent with structural integrity, with no armor and no self-sealing protection around its fuel supply. A 2-second burst from a Hellcat's gun battery was, in the words of the technical evaluation reports that circulated through American fleet squadrons in 1943 and 1944, essentially decisive. The Zero's 20mm Type 99 cannons carried 100 rounds per gun in the improved A6M5 variant that would face Hellcats over the Philippine Sea. This was a meaningful improvement over the 60-round drum of the original A6M2. But the rounds were being fired at an aircraft whose fuel system was designed to survive puncture, whose pilot was seated behind armor that the 20mm round could penetrate, but would not always kill the man it reached, and whose structural integrity was sufficient to absorb battle damage that would have destroyed a Zero. This asymmetry was not abstract. It was the concrete physical reality that Japanese pilots would encounter on June 19th, 1944, when they fired their cannons at Hellcats that shuddered, trailed smoke, and kept flying. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. The American pilots who would fly the Hellcat into the Philippine Sea engagement carried a different psychological relationship with their aircraft than the Zero pilots flying toward them. The American pilot knew he could absorb a hit. He did not have to fly with the continuous awareness that a single burst of accurate enemy fire through his fuel system would ignite him. He could make the aggressive tactical choice that exposed him momentarily to defensive fire, accept the hit if it came, and continue. The Zero pilot had no such margin. Every second he spent in a position where an enemy could fire at him was a second in which a single well-placed burst could produce catastrophic results. This difference in what each aircraft could tolerate did not merely affect the physical outcome of combat engagements. It shaped the aggressiveness with which pilots committed to attacks, the willingness of formation leaders to accept defensive exposure in pursuit of offensive opportunity, and the confidence with which replacement pilots entered their first engagements. The American replacement pilot arriving in a Pacific Fleet squadron in mid-1944 carried between 250 and 350 hours of documented flight time, including advanced gunnery training, instrument work, and tactical instruction delivered by combat veterans who had been rotated back from frontline deployments specifically to serve as instructors. He had been taught by men who had survived engagements with the Zero and knew precisely what the Zero could and could not do. The Japanese replacement pilot entering fleet service in the same period carried a substantially reduced flight time total. The Yokorin training pipeline, designed to produce a small number of highly skilled aviators in peacetime, had not been built to absorb the attrition rates that 2.5 years of combat against an industrial opponent had imposed. The veterans who should have been teaching the next generation were mostly dead, their experience consumed by the tactical system that had kept them in combat without rotation until the law of probability found them. The replacement pilots filling the squadrons of Ozawa's mobile fleet in June of 1944 had been trained more quickly by instructors with less experience on aircraft types they had not yet fully mastered, and they were flying those aircraft into an engagement they were not equipped to survive in the numbers required. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet, the Imperial Japanese Navy's remaining carrier striking force, as it moved into the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. His disposition included 9 carriers, of which 5 were fleet carriers. The air complement across those carriers totaled approximately 450 aircraft, a force that had been built to execute a tactical concept Ozawa called the outer air battle. His plan called for launching his aircraft at extreme range, beyond what American carrier aircraft could reach in return, striking the American fleet, and then recovering not to his own carriers, but to land-based airfields on Guam, Rota, and Tinian, where they would refuel and rearm before returning to their ships. The concept extended his effective strike radius, while theoretically keeping his carriers safe from American counterattack. It required that his aircraft survive long enough to reach both the target and the recovery airfield. And it assumed that the American fleet would be located and engaged without the defensive advantage of early warning. That assumption was wrong in a way that would define the entire engagement. The radar systems aboard the carriers of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 were capable of detecting airborne contacts at ranges exceeding 150 miles. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 67 destroyers, with an air group totaling approximately 950 aircraft, of which the majority were Hellcats, moved through the Philippine Sea under the guidance of combat information centers that had been refining fighter direction procedures for 2 years. The officer coordinating the defense aboard USS Lexington on the morning of June the 19th was Commander Joseph Eggert, whose fighter direction team had developed the intercept geometry and radio communication procedures into something closer to a precision instrument than to the improvisational responses that had characterized the early carrier battles of 1942. Ozawa's first strike wave launched at approximately 7:25 in the morning. Between 64 and 69 aircraft, a mixed formation of A6M50s, Yokosuka D-4 wide-duty dive bombers, and Nakajima B-6N Jill torpedo bombers, assembled west of the fleet and turned east toward the American carriers. They had more than 250 miles to fly. They climbed to cruise altitude and settled into formation. Commander Eggert's radar screens showed them before 8 o'clock. By the time the Japanese formation had completed its assembly and established its eastbound track, Eggert had transmitted intercept vectors and altitude assignments to Hellcat formations that were already climbing. 50 fighters reached 24,000 feet, approximately 200 miles from the fleet, by 10 in the morning. They were above the approaching Japanese formation. They had full fuel. They had full ammunition. They knew, from the precise radar tracks being read to them over the radio, exactly where the enemy was. At 10 minutes after 10 on the morning of June the 19th, 1944, the first Hellcats rolled into their attack on the Japanese first wave. The precise sequence of what followed across the next 90 minutes has been reconstructed from after-action reports filed by American squadron commanders, pilot debriefs conducted aboard the carriers that afternoon, and from post-war Japanese accounts compiled by historians with access to surviving aviator testimony and naval records. What those sources collectively describe does not resemble the kind of air battle that either side's doctrine had anticipated. It resembles, instead, the mathematical consequence of everything that had been decided in the engineering rooms and training commands on both sides over the preceding 7 years. The Japanese first wave, which had been in the air for approximately 2.5 hours by the time American Hellcats reached it, arrived at the engagement zone in something resembling the formation structure with which it had launched. The Zero escort fighters, a 6M5 variants drawn from the air groups of Ozawa's carrier fleet, flew cover for the mixed formation of dive bombers and torpedo bombers that were the wave's primary striking element. The Zero pilots had been briefed on expected air opposition. They had not been briefed on the radar range at which that opposition would be organized and vectored against them. Lieutenant Alex Vrashu of Fighter Squadron 16, flying an F6F Hellcat from the deck of USS Lexington, made visual contact with the Japanese first wave at altitude, while still several miles from the nearest enemy aircraft. He had been frustrated during the outbound transit by an engine running rough that had forced him to maintain a slower cruise speed than he wanted, leaving him below the main concentration of Hellcats that Commander Eggert's fighter direction team had positioned for the intercept. As the Japanese formation came into view, Vrashu assessed the geometry. The Yokosuka D-4 wide-duty dive bombers constituting the primary striking element were flying in a loose formation at a lower altitude than the Zero escort, their fixed undercarriage and comparatively slow cruise speed making them identifiable at range. The Zero escort was positioned to meet threats approaching from the front or sides. Vrashu descended to build airspeed, positioned his Hellcat for a high-side approach on the bombers, and made his first attack from above and behind. The duty he targeted had no effective evasive option available at the speed and angle of the attack. Vrashu's 50 caliber guns fired for approximately a second and a half. The aircraft exploded. He repeated the process. The sequence, as he described it in his post-flight debrief and in subsequent published accounts, had the character of a methodical geometric exercise rather than a maneuvering dogfight. He was not engaged in the close-range turning combat that the Zero's design had been optimized to dominate. He was selecting targets in a formation that could not adequately protect itself against attack from the angles he was using, firing controlled bursts, and disengaging before the Zero escort could close to weapons range. The Hellcat's speed made disengagement straightforward. The Hellcat's armor allowed him to accept the marginal exposure of a deflection shot from a Zero that had not yet achieved a clean attack position. 6 aircraft, 8 minutes. When Vrashu landed back aboard Lexington and climbed from the cockpit, he held up 6 fingers to the men on the flight deck. His aircraft had not been hit. His engagement was one thread in a larger and simultaneous sequence of destruction that was consuming the Japanese first wave across a broad stretch of the Philippine Sea. The Hellcat squadrons that had climbed to altitude on Eggert's vectors had reached the intercept with the altitude advantage, the airspeed advantage, and the positional advantage that radar-guided direction had created. They attacked from the high side, from the quarter, and from directly above. Angles that the Zero escort's positioning had not fully accounted for, because those were precisely the angles that American tactical doctrine had identified in Sanders' Akutan evaluation as the ones the Zero could not effectively counter at high speed. The Zeros could not follow the Hellcats through high-speed rolling maneuvers. The Zeros could not sustain a precise pursuit above 250 miles per hour. The Zero pilots were facing an opponent who would not give them the fight their aircraft had been built to win. And when they did fire on Hellcats, the Hellcats did not reliably burn. This was a rupture in the operating assumptions of the Japanese air groups that went beyond tactical frustration. Every experienced Japanese naval aviator had been shaped by a doctrine that assigned specific and predictable outcomes to specific actions. A Zero pilot who closed to 100 yards and fired accurately expected a result. Over 3 years of combat across the Pacific, that result had been consistent. In the course of this engagement, it was not consistent. Hellcats absorbed hits from the Type 99 cannons, shuddered, and kept flying. The self-sealing rubber sealed the punctures in the fuel tanks. The armor deflected or absorbed rounds that would have been fatal in an unprotected cockpit. The bulletproof glass in the windshield stopped fragments that would have killed the man behind it in the curved, unarmored canopy of a Zero. A pilot who saw that happen once could attribute it to an unfavorable angle or a missed fuel system. A pilot who watched it happen repeatedly, while the aircraft attacking him operated under different rules, was encountering something that individual skill could not resolve. The first wave of 64 to 69 Japanese aircraft lost approximately 42 before the survivors turned back. Of those that continued toward the task force through the Hellcat intercept, most were driven off or destroyed by the combat air patrol over the fleet and by anti-aircraft fire from the escorting surface vessels. A small number reached attack range. None struck an American carrier. Ozawa's second wave launched from his carriers at approximately 8:56 in the morning. 128 aircraft, Zeros, Judas, Jills, and elements of his heaviest available strike complement. This was the largest single strike the mobile fleet could assemble. It was also the most catastrophically destroyed. Radar aboard the American carriers picked up the second wave at approximately 115 miles. Additional Hellcat squadrons were vectored to the intercept. Approximately 40 Hellcats met the second wave before it had closed to within 50 miles of the fleet. Of the 128 aircraft that launched in this wave, approximately 97 were destroyed. 31 aircraft survived the air engagements. Of those, a number were damaged. Some flew to Guam or Rota because they could not complete the return to their carriers. Of those that reached Guam, American aircraft staged for precisely the contingency engaged and destroyed many of them in the landing pattern and on the ground. The third wave, approximately 47 aircraft launched around 10 in the morning, lost a portion of its formation to navigation errors in the confusion of radio silence and unfamiliar combat conditions. Some aircraft misidentified Guam as their target area. Of the 47 aircraft in the wave, approximately 7 survived the engagement. The fourth wave, some 80 aircraft launched at around 11 in the morning, encountered the same defensive geometry that had consumed its predecessors. The Hellcat squadrons had been refueled and rearmed. The fighter direction teams were still tracking contacts. The returns were proportionally similar to the earlier waves. What was happening beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea during these engagements introduced a second dimension to the day that neither the Japanese pilots overhead nor most American aviators could see from where they were fighting. At approximately 9:10 in the morning, while the first wave was still in transit, USS Albacore, a United States Fleet submarine commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, was running at periscope depth in waters north of the main engagement area. Blanchard had acquired a large surface vessel in his periscope and identified it as a Japanese fleet carrier. He had a partial torpedo solution and insufficient time to complete a full fire control calculation before the carrier would pass out of his firing arc. He fired 6 Mark 18 electric torpedoes at a range of approximately 5,000 yards. The carrier he had found was the Taiho, Ozawa's fleet flagship and the largest, most modern fleet carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy. She was on her first combat operation. One torpedo hit her forward starboard quarter at 9:10 in the morning. The hit was not immediately catastrophic. The Taiho displaced more than 33,000 tons and had been designed with damage control in mind. Ozawa remained aboard his flagship and continued directing the battle. What the damage control teams did not fully contain in the following hours was aviation fuel vapor spreading through the ship's internal ventilation system from a ruptured fuel line. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, that vapor ignited. The resulting explosions and fire consumed the Taiho within hours of the ignition. Less than 2 hours after the Albacore's attack, at approximately 11:22 in the morning, USS Kavala, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler, found and attacked the fleet carrier Shokaku at a range of approximately 1,200 yards. The Shokaku was a veteran of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, one of the most experienced ships in the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier arm. Kostler fired 6 torpedoes. 3 struck the Shokaku. Fires broke out in the aviation fuel storage spaces, and the ship sank within hours. 2 fleet carriers, including Ozawa's flagship, destroyed by American submarines on the same morning that his aircraft were being consumed by American fighters above the Philippine Sea. Both mechanisms operated simultaneously, and neither knew what the other was doing. Ozawa, transferred to another flagship before the Taiho was lost, attempted to reconstruct the day's results from the fragmentary after-action reports that reached him. The surviving pilots from his strike waves had not been reporting in a coordinated way. Radio communications were incomplete. Pilots who had survived the Hellcat intercepts and reached the vicinity of the American fleet had experienced a chaotic engagement in which they had fired at what they believed to be valid targets and turned back without confirmation of results. Some reported, in good faith, that they had scattered the American fighters and that the fleet had been struck. They had not been lying. They were reporting what they had experienced. From inside the cockpit of an aircraft under attack, surrounded by formations breaking in multiple directions, it was not possible to know what the engagement as a whole had produced. Ozawa transmitted to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo that the engagement had been a Japanese tactical success. He prepared to resume the battle the following morning. The actual tallies were being compiled aboard the American carriers as he wrote. On June the 19th, 1944, Ozawa's mobile fleet launched 4 coordinated strike waves against Task Force 58. Of the approximately 373 aircraft committed to those strikes, American after-action assessments and post-war cross-reference Japanese records indicate that between 240 and 270 were destroyed in the air engagements, with additional losses among aircraft that diverted to Guam and Rota. American aircraft lost in combat that day numbered approximately 22. Not 22 squadrons, not 22 formations, 22 individual aircraft. The men of the American carrier squadrons who had carried out that day's fighting were aware, even in the immediate aftermath, that the event scale was without precedent in their experience. The consistent observation across multiple post-flight debriefs was the behavior of the Japanese formations under attack. Many continued on their attack headings after losing aircraft, a pattern that American pilots attributed variously to courage, to training limitations, and to the rigid formation discipline that Japanese doctrine enforced. What Japanese aviator testimony collected after the war makes clearer is that many of those pilots were operating at the boundary of their navigational and tactical capabilities, maintaining their assigned heading, because departing from the planned course introduced a disorientation they had not been trained to manage under combat conditions. The rigid doctrine that had been built around the Zero's performance had not included provision for a situation in which the performance was insufficient. On the evening of June the 19th, Ozawa's carriers recovered what aircraft they could locate. Of more than 400 aircraft embarked at the start of the operation, the mobile fleet's air groups had been reduced to approximately 100 serviceable aircraft by nightfall. Mitchell did not wait for the morning. American search aircraft located the retreating mobile fleet late in the afternoon of June the 20th at a range of approximately 275 miles, at the outer limit of effective carrier aircraft strike range. Mitchell launched 216 aircraft into a dusk sky, fully aware they would be returning in darkness. They found the fleet. They sank the carrier Hyo, damaged multiple other vessels, and destroyed what remained of the mobile fleet's air complement before the strike turned back toward the American task force 200 miles east. What followed was the American cost. Of the 216 aircraft Mitchell had launched, approximately 109 ran out of fuel or made water landings in the darkness of the Philippine Sea, overwhelmed by the combination of distance, darkness, and the difficulty of locating carrier decks at night over open water. Mitchell made the decision to illuminate his fleet. Deck lights on, searchlights pointed skyward, the task force exposed to any Japanese submarine in the area. His pilots found the lights and landed. Rescue operations mounted immediately recovered the majority of air crews from the water. American personnel losses were substantially lower than the aircraft numbers suggested because the surface ships swept the area through the night. Ozawa's mobile fleet carried home from the Philippine Sea the statistical residue of what had been the primary offensive instrument of Japanese naval aviation. Of the approximately 450 aircraft embarked at the start of the operation, fewer than 130 were recovered by the time the fleet reached port. The pilots who had spent years learning to read the Zero's control responses and use its maneuverability with the physical intuition the doctrine required were gone in proportions that a training pipeline running on reduced fuel allocations and abbreviated instructor courses could not address in months or years. The post-war accounts of Japanese pilots who survived the Philippine Sea engagement return across multiple published memoirs and collected testimonies to a consistent and specific shared experience. The Hellcats would not die the way enemy aircraft were supposed to die. Saburo Sakai, the most celebrated Japanese naval aviator to survive the war, wrote in his post-war memoir that by 1944, American pilots were fighting with a physical confidence in their aircraft that the opponents of 1941 and 1942 had not displayed. He attributed this to training, to tactical doctrine, and to what he identified as the psychological difference produced by flying an aircraft that would absorb a hit and continue. A pilot who knows his machine can take punishment, Sakai observed, makes different choices than a pilot who knows it cannot. This was not an abstract observation. It was the operational expression of the engineering decision made 7 years earlier in a Nagoya design room, when the engineers of Mitsubishi and the procurement officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy looked at the requirements document and decided that the weight of armor and self-sealing tanks was weight they could not afford. The decision was not irrational given the constraints. The engine available was underpowered. The performance specifications were non-negotiable. The trade had to be made somewhere. What made the trade catastrophic over time was not that it produced a weak aircraft. The Zero was not a weak aircraft. What made it catastrophic was that the trade assumed a set of conditions: permanent tactical advantage, opponents who would always be surprised, pilots who would never be distracted or outmatched, or simply shot from behind during the 100th hour of a tour without rotation. And when those conditions changed, the aircraft offered the man inside it nothing. When the Shokaku sank in the Philippine Sea on June the 19th, 1944, she took down with her not just the crew lost in those hours, but the last institutional memory of the fleet that had opened the war. She had been in the Pearl Harbor Strike Force. She had fought at the Coral Sea, at the Eastern Solomons, and at Santa Cruz. She was the last carrier link to the experience base that had made Japanese naval aviation formidable. The knowledge that went down with her crew was not the kind of knowledge that can be written into a training syllabus and handed to recruits. The carriers that appeared at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944 appeared as decoys. Their flight decks were empty or nearly so. They were used to draw American carriers away from the surface engagement because there were not enough experienced aviators remaining to conduct an effective airstrike. The institution that had produced the men who bombed Pearl Harbor, that had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse within hours of Pearl Harbor, and before most Americans knew the war had begun, had been reduced to a tactical feint. At 10:17 in the morning on June the 19th, 1944, a Japanese naval aviator pressed his trigger and watched a Hellcat absorb the burst and keep flying. That single moment contained the entire argument, not in any one aircraft or any one pilot, but in the engineering choices that had produced both machines and the doctrines that had governed how they were used. The pilot who fired the burst was not outclassed in the way that would be insulting to reduce him to. He was a professional operating a weapon system that had been designed without margin against a weapon system that had been designed with it. The Hellcat was not invincible. It was something more practically significant than invincible. It was designed by people who understood that their pilots were going to be hit and who decided that when that moment came, the machine's job was to absorb the blow and bring the man home. That decision, made in a drafting room in Bethpage, New York, paid its dividend above the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 in numbers that were not close. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.